So good afternoon from the Atlantic coast. I'm on the Delaware shore this morning at one of the old coastal defenses of the United States. A series of coastal defenses established between really the 1770s, so that pre-Revolutionary War period, and maintained as coastal defenses some of these posts right up until the Cold War. What we're looking at here, I'm at Fort Miles today, which was towards the end was district headquarters for the harbour defences of the Delaware River. I'm looking at a 15-inch gun here that was not actually part of the coastal artillery batteries here at Fort Miles. This is actually a naval gun taken off of the battleship Missouri, the Mighty Mo. If anybody's been out to Hawaii, you can tour the Missouri. You remember her as the ship on which the Japanese surrender was signed in Tokyo Bay in 1945. This is one of her original guns, and it's here on display at Fort Miles. Hello, how are you today? We are today out and about looking at the coastal defences of what was the Delaware River Gap. So the Delaware River. Now, why would you want to defend that? Several reasons. Most importantly is it's a very important commercial river. It's what links the city of Philadelphia down the Delaware River to the Atlantic Ocean. So if you're coming down the New Jersey coast and you round Cape May at the bottom, where the Cape May ferry is, and the Coast Guard cap on today, Coasties cap today, but where the Coast Guard base is at Cape May and the Coast Guard recruit training center is at Cape May, you round the Cape there, the Jersey Cape, come up the Delaware River, you proceed up the Delaware River with New Jersey on one side, Delaware on the other side, and eventually you're going to come up to Pennsylvania on one side, past where Pennsylvania International Airport is now. There's a fort there, Fort Mifflin, and you're going to come up to the city of Philadelphia itself with Camden on the other side. So an important city going back to the colonial era, the British colonial era, important riverway going back to the Dutch and the Swedish colonial eras. So preceding British settlement, there was Dutch and Swedish settlement through this area. And not only then that just commercial route up to a major important city, but as the 19th century, those late 1800s progressed, and the 20th century with World War I and World War II, this was a major industrial river as well, with particularly docks and shipyards, very important shipyards certainly during World War II. Wilmington, Delaware developed emergency shipyards and built a lot of destroyer escorts there, Wilmington, Delaware, and of course the shipyards at Camden, New Jersey, and at the Philadelphia Navy Yard itself built aircraft carrier and battleships. This was a very important strategic area, and you want to protect that area. So this has been an area that has needed to have been protected, going back to the colonial era, right through the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, that interwar period of uncertainty, World War II, and in some instances even into the Cold War. So I'm at Fort Miles today. Fort Miles was the last of the fortifications, the last of the coastal fortifications built on this Delaware River stretch. It is the furthest south, the closest to the Atlantic. In fact, if I flip the camera and well, that was the Atlantic over there. So I'm really close on the Atlantic shore at the moment. Just flip the camera back again if we can. So I'm at Fort Miles, but I want to talk about the earlier developments first as you come really down the river from the earliest settlements. And as I said, those earliest settlements in the 1600s, so at the time that William Penn is being given a charter for establishing a colony of Pennsylvania, this is also an area in which the Dutch and the Swedish are looking to settle. Particularly, we think of something like New Sweden, which is now Christiana, Delaware. And if you go to old Newcastle, Delaware, and you'll see the old State House there, you'll see that as well as flying historic Stars and Stripes, it flies the American flag, it flies historically a British flag, it also flies historically a Swedish flag as well, to note that colonial era. So some of the earliest settlements along the river were fortified settlements, such as Fort Casimir. So an early colonial settlement in which there's an indigenous Native American population living in the area, and also other colonial powers that might want to raid your settlement. So typically, a riverside settlement would have been stockaded. So Jamestown was stockaded in Virginia. So Fort Casimir, Christiana, those places were stockaded in exactly the same way as small trading settlements that were stockaded. Initial protection for trade and commerce along the river. Now, as Philadelphia developed as a major city and became not just one of the largest commercial centres and cities in the American colonies, but if you take the British Empire as a whole and you include Philadelphia as a British city, it's one of the largest and most important British cities. It's up there with London and with Bristol and with important commercial centres back in England. Philadelphia ranks amongst the top commercial centres that are British cities. So it's a very important colonial centre, and it's a very important centre of British imperial trade. Now, the British government knew that they would have to protect Philadelphia. The French and Indian War has been fought, King George's War has been fought, Pontiac's Rebellion has been fought. So the notion is planted in the head of the British government that Philadelphia is vulnerable from the sea. If a French fleet, if a French squadron can round the Cape, sail up uncontested, up the Delaware River, lay off of Philadelphia and bombard Philadelphia, that could prove fatal in any future war with France. So what the British do is they find Mudflat Island, which is now down kind of behind where Philadelphia International Airport is. If you drive around the perimeter fence of Philadelphia Airport towards the north perimeter fence of Philadelphia Airport, follow the signs towards historic Fort Mifflin, you'll come across Fort Mifflin, really the first of these deliberately established forts that are built to protect the Delaware River and protect Philadelphia itself. So Fort Mifflin is built by the British Army. They bring out professional engineers to survey the site and design a fort. And they build Fort Mifflin starting in 1771. That's when the fort is established. There are some improvements that will be done to that. But Fort Mifflin is a well-established fort. If you look at an aerial photograph of it, and you see the almost pentagram shape of it with the bastion corners in which heavy guns can be mounted, you can see that Fort Mifflin is not only defensible against attack from the river, but also defensible against attack from the landward side as well. So it's one of the first important defences of the Delaware River itself. Fort Mifflin will see some action during the Revolutionary War. It will initially be held by the Patriots. You know, the Declaration of Independence takes place, of course, in Philadelphia. The Fort Mifflin is left by the British and held by Patriots. They're in the British campaign of 1777, where the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Paoli and the Battle of Germantown, when the British are moving to capture Philadelphia, General Howe's Philadelphia campaign, Fort Mifflin will eventually fall to the British in an assault, as will Fort Mercer, a smaller fort on the other side of the river. So Fort Mifflin will fall to the British. When the British abandon Philadelphia, of course, it will pass back into American hands. But it's a very important feature for the British, because during that Philadelphia campaign of 1777, when the British are marching, General Howe's troops are marching north from Brandywine to attack Philadelphia and capture Philadelphia. What they really wanted was they wanted naval support on the river that could attack land marines and attack Philadelphia with bombardment from the river. But because the Americans hold this battery of guns at Fort Mifflin, that actually denies the British access to the upper reaches of the Delaware River and denies them naval access to Philadelphia during that campaign, which is of course why then the British have to launch a land attack against Fort Mifflin and capture Fort Mifflin by ground assault, and try and wrest that away from American control. Once those river defenses are wrested away from American control, of course, holding Philadelphia for the Patriots becomes almost untenable, because now the river is freely navigable and the powerful Royal Navy can bring men of war, full-size ships. We're not talking about small boats. We're talking about, you know, if the those Philadelphia shipyards can build an aircraft carrier or a battleship, it's the same in the 1770s as well. You can bring a man of war up there. You can bring a third-rate 63 gunner. You can bring a 74 gunner. You can bring a 101 gunship up the Delaware River and really do some serious damage. So that makes Philadelphia almost indefensible. So that's really the first fort that is established in the area in a serious way to defend the Delaware River and Philadelphia. Now, as the war progresses and the War of 1812 comes and goes, and the War of 1812 with British coastal raids in particular, the War of 1812, there are coastal raids by the Royal Navy up and down the Chesapeake Bay, up and down the Delaware River, up and down the coast, in which the Royal Navy will bombard places, land small parties of blue jackets and Marines, and raid along the coast. That becomes a very typical British tactic of the War of 1812. And so in defense of that, in a way to defend that, the Americans establish, I'm going to get up and move a little bit now, the Americans get up and establish additional batteries. So they're temporary batteries that are established really for the War of 1812 itself. So, for example, battery at Elk Neck on the Chesapeake Bay, on the upper reaches of Chesapeake Bay, typical of a earthen battery with some stockading, some bastions that are reinforced by wood and sand and stone, but typically earthworks where a few guns are mounted to provide additional river and coastal defence during this War of 1812 period. After the War of 1812, it's evident to the American government, evident to the War Department in particular, that cities are vulnerable to attack, and that serious thought must be given to coastal artillery and coastal defence. And I'll just here get a good view of the size of that gun off of the Missouri, and also an example of one of the Missouri's shells, which is bigger than me, weighs a lot more than me, and the damage that an armor-piercing shell can do to 24 inches of hardened steel armor. So we're not talking about pop guns there, we're talking about serious artillery. So in the period after the War of 1812, serious thought now has to be given to coastal defense. And in the Delaware River, in the middle of the river, laying between the New Jersey on one bank and the state of Delaware on the southern bank, is an island called Peapatch Island, just below Wilmington in the bend of the river. Today, Delaware City and the oil refinery is on the Delaware bank, and largely undeveloped, really, on the other side of the river until you get up to Salem. There's a nuclear power station at Salem, New Jersey. We're looking behind me at the moment at I believe this is what are we looking at here? We're looking at an 8-inch gun. We're looking at model 1905, modification 2, 8-inch gun, very typical of the coastal guns that were established here and deployed here in batteries. Not out in the open like this, they're out in the open for display today, but we're establishing batteries here at Fort Miles. Very typical 8-inch gun. This one had a range of about 15 miles. Very heavy artillery to load and reload. So the crew of this, including the people that were responsible for loading the gun, a crew of about 25 men per gun in battery. So if you had several guns in battery, you can imagine you'd need hundreds of men manning these coastal defences. So Peapatch Island is if you go today, and if you don't actually get up to the fort, on Pea Patch Island is a lot of long grass similar to this, a lot of low-lying swampy ground. You'll see a lot of good wildlife there, muskrats, etc. But it's right in the middle of the island, and there is a raised section in the middle of the island. What the Corps of Engineers decided they would do is they would build a fort there and call it Fort Delaware. There'd been previous batteries placed on the island during the War of 1812, really temporary fortifications, but they decided they would build a brick-faced, stone-faced fort on Pea Patch Island, call it Fort Delaware, and mount the most advanced heavy artillery in the fort that could be mounted in that period. So construction on the fort began in 1846. Construction halted in 1860 towards the beginning of the Civil War. So it took a long time to make bricks, ship bricks out to the island, build this fort, and it's a very, very large fort today. Maintained by the state of Delaware as a state park. You can take a ferry from Delaware City out to the island, visit the fort, tour the islands, nature reserves. The fort itself is very well preserved for the period of the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. There is a firing columbiad cannon there. I believe at 1 o'clock every day they fire that columbiad cannon. They put a small powder charge in it. They don't put a full charge in it, but that small powder charge is enough to, make your eardrums rattle a little bit. But so Fort Delaware is established and is really the prominent harbour defence of that period, in that pre-Civil War period. And then during the Civil War, of course, we hear these stories of the CSS Alabama. We hear of these commerce raiders, these Confederate ships that could raid. So Fort Delaware itself served a defensive purpose during the Civil War. Additional defences were built on the land side, particularly on the Delaware bank, guarding not only the flank of the fort but also the mouth of what's the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. That's the canal that links across Delaware and across Maryland. This canal links the Delaware River and the Chesapeake Bay for commercial shipping. So you'll see container ships move across this canal. This is still in use, still a dredged canal and capable of handling very large ships, not just kind of like little narrow canal boats. We're talking like major shipping that can use this canal. So a very important highway. It means you can, in a day, traverse from, in the period, in a day you can traverse from the Delaware to the Chesapeake Bay without having to go all the way down the Delaware, around the Cape, all the way down Virginia, around into Hampton Roads and pass up the Chesapeake Bay, all the way up towards Baltimore and Port of Baltimore that way. You don't have to go the long way around, several days travel. You can take a shortcut on this canal. So it's a very important canal, very strategic canal that needs to be protected as well. So an additional battery is put in there. That will eventually become Fort DuPont. So we now have 2 batteries. We have the big main fort on Pea Patch Island, Fort Delaware. We have a smaller fort established at Fort DuPont. That's established in 1863. Fort DuPont will develop into a more important post as well. So it's not only the guns that are placed there, but we see the first use of really what we would today refer as a minefield. In the Civil War period, in that period, 1850s, 1860s, they are referred to as torpedoes. They are sunken underwater and are detonated remotely. So when you hear the phrase, "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," we're not talking about a submarine firing torpedoes, we're talking about mines. There's minefields between the 2 ports, and the navigable channel is controlled. This is a model 1905 Mark D 6-inch gun. It was one of the original guns from here at Fort Miles. So as I'm walking around today, we're passing a lot of the artillery. I'm going to stand under the shade of this poplar tree because I would like the shade of this tree. So again, this had a range of about 15 miles. There were several of these 6-inch guns here at Fort Miles, placed in 2 batteries. Battery Hunter and Battery Herring, pointing out to sea, 15 miles out to sea, is quite a good defensive range for that early 20th century period. So, where were we? Fort DuPont. Fort DuPont completed in 1863. Fort DuPont is an interesting place. Fort DuPont remained a military base throughout what we call the Endicott period. So, in 1885, the Secretary of War, William Endicott, established a board of ordnance to review coastal defences, and they came up with a list of improvements that needed to be made, a list of new sites that needed to be built, a list of sites that were already in existence that could be improved, and also how to implement the new technology, particularly the idea of a disappearing gun. So when you look at a Civil War fort, when you go out to Fort Delaware and you see that big Columbiad mounted on the northeast corner of Fort Delaware, and you see that it's very much in the open, so the crew would be exposed to shrapnel from enemy weapons and even small arms fire. So the idea was developed in the period after the Civil War, in the period of the 1880s and the 1890s particular, of what were called disappearing carriages, disappearing guns. So using a variety of methods, but eventually hydraulic method, the gun would be mounted on a hydraulic system. So when the gun was not in use, it would be lowered below the parapet of the fort, down into the depths of the fort, where it could be loaded. These are heavy guns, firing heavy shells that have to be physically manhandled, often with block and tackle and multiple men to load these guns. It's not a fast process. This is not fast firing artillery of like boom, boom, boom. We're talking perhaps minutes between shots. So above the parapet are very small fire direction towers. I posted a photograph of one of those at Fort Mott in the group here, so that you could actually see that. You see this small tower, which looks like a watchtower, a fire tower. You don't see any guns at all. They're actually hidden below an artificial hill being loaded. And once the gun instructions are given to the gun and it comes ready to fire, and the instructions are fed in to fire that gun, the hydraulic system will raise that gun up. It trains, it fires, and then it immediately comes back down on that hydraulic system below the parapet, down into safety, to prevent counter-battery fire and also allow the gun to continue in action. So that becomes the thing of what we call the Endicott program. That's one of the major innovations, is these hidden disappearing batteries. So in the military park here at Fort Miles, where I am today, Fort Miles, Delaware, this was a military reservation quite late into the 1950s, I believe. And so this behind me here is, well, you would have seen these really in operation until the 1970s. This is a model 114A2 howitzer, 155mm howitzer. Of course, they've been replaced now by the M109 self-propelled gun, the Paladin, also the M770 howitzer. But this was a gun. The original model of the gun was a Model 1918 Mark I, very similar 155mm field howitzer. It developed over time and developed over time and developed over time. And this 114A2 is very much of that. Towards the end of the World War II, Korean War, into the Vietnam War and Cold War period gun. So some of these were actually installed here in the latter part of operation at Fort Miles. They were in battery 22, and there were 4 of these guns placed in a battery that really controlled access at this precise point where the ferry is. The Cape May Delaware ferry is just up the road about a mile or so, and this battery of guns particularly controlled that ferry crossing. So even though not mounted in huge strong bastions, and these could be, as you can see, with a carriage trail, and you pack up that carriage trail and attach it to an artillery tractor, you can move that any way you want around this place. And if you want to swing those around for landward defense, you can. If you want to swing them back towards the coast for coastal defense, you can. So that's a 114 155mm howitzer. And now where were we and what were we talking about? We were talking about the Endicott period. So the Endicott period sees a very large expansion of the coastal defences here in the Delaware area, and the Delaware River coastal defences and harbour defences. The establishment, the guns at, excuse me, it's a very hot day today, the guns at Fort Delaware, the old Columbiads, the old Rodman cannons are removed. New batteries are installed, these disappearing batteries just further outside the walls of the original fort, with heavier 10-inch, 12-inch guns. Fort DuPont receives 10-inch guns on disappearing carriages. On the New Jersey bank of the river, in 1896, a new fort is built, Fort Mott. That's still there today. You can tour Fort Mott as well. Most of these places you can tour. You can tour Fort Mifflin, you can tour Fort Delaware, you can tour Fort DuPont, you can tour Fort Mott, and you can tour here at Fort Miles. Some of them kind of free to walk into. You can walk for free into Fort Mott over there in New Jersey. Fort Miles here in Delaware being a state park. If you are a resident of Delaware, of course, it's easy for you to gain access. If you're a non-resident, access to a state park for the day is $10. You get to hang out at the park, use the picnic areas, go sit on the beach. So I'm going to take full advantage of this park later on today. But Fort Mott is built as a result of the Endicott program. It has 2 main batteries of guns. It has a 12-inch battery in Battery Archer and a 10-inch battery in Battery Harker. Is it Abbott or Harker? Yes, anyway, 12 and 10-inch batteries, which are in that disappearing carriage system. I did a tour from Fort Mott a little over a year ago, which might be up on YouTube, saved on YouTube. So I will try and find a copy of that and post a link to that tour where we're walking around Fort Mott, and we actually get down into some of the positions, the lower positions where the disappearing gun carriages were. If you'll excuse me. Getting out of the way of a school party here. We're getting towards the end of the school year. As any history teacher will tell you, hooray, 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 we're at the end of the school year. This is the great time for all the AP exams are done now. A lot of the standardised testing is done. This is a good time to get students out into the field to actually look at some stuff. So this behind me here is a Mark 22 Model 2 8-inch coastal artillery gun. These could be mounted in several ways. This one here, as you can see, is on a wagon mount. It would have been mounted on a wheeled carriage that could have been propelled either by land if you had good pneumatic tires underneath it, or if you put it on railroad tracks and had a railroad run ring, you could move it around by railroad track if you wanted to as well. So this is representative of the 8-inch guns, and these things would fire a beast, a 260-pound shell. So 260 pounds of armor-piercing steel. So I'm a large chap. Turn me, all 6'1" of me, into armor-piercing steel. Fire me out of that cannon. 20 miles out at sea, I'm going to hit your battleship and I'm going to do some serious damage to it. So, yeah, representative of the 8-inch gun batteries that were here at Fort Miles. So we're seeing a lot of ordnance today. If you want to come out to Fort Miles, it's great if you're an artillery head, if you love the ordnance. Of course, do not climb on these things. These are historic items. These are preserved items, but you can come out, you can get as close as you want to these if you're looking for manufacturer markings, if you're looking for great detail on the gun, such as, you want to get close to have a look at this shell carriage in which a shell would be rolled on these small tracks. So you bring the shell in here, you'd push it on with a hydraulic ram, then you could run the track. You wouldn't have to carry this gun into the breech, close the breech up, train up that gun. You could do it manually, you could do it automatically, you could fire by radar. And when we get talking about World War II, you'd certainly aim and fire by radar, radio direction. But you could manually aim these with good old-fashioned pneumatic rangefinders, and you could fire these manually as well, the good old-fashioned way. So I noticed that some footage the other day coming from Ukraine of model 177 howitzers that have been supplied to them. I don't know who supplied those. They may have been supplied by Canada or the United States, but whoever supplied those 155mm howitzers to the Ukrainians did not supply them with all the complicated state-of-the-art fire direction systems. These pieces, these 155mm howitzers that are being supplied to Ukraine need to be rushed into service very, very quickly. And so what the trainers are doing when the Ukrainian volunteers, a lot of these people are volunteers. Remember, the Ukrainian army itself is only about 39,000 strong in the Ukrainian core of its army. The rest of the army is volunteers, and we're talking about a volunteer strength that is planned to be over 1 million strong, but at the moment we're talking maybe 100,000 volunteers of people who volunteered to be in the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces. Some of those are being equipped with donated artillery. There's not the time to train them how to use the computers, how to use the radar, etc., etc. So they're being taught how to do it the old-fashioned way. They're being taught to aim and control that gun by Mark 1 eyeball, and to fire those manually. So that's able. I was watching footage of that the other day, where I was thinking, my goodness, they're actually doing this the good old-fashioned way. They are loading and firing by hand. So these could be loaded and fired by hand, as I said, or they could in World War II, in that later World War II period. In the Cold War period, coastal artillery would be radio direction and aimed and fired by radar. The forts continued in use throughout the 1880s and 1890s as those Endicott period forts and those Endicott period improvements came into being. So the forts were there in time for the Spanish-American War. If there had been any threat by the Spanish fleet to the mainland United States, which there was probably not going to be, but it was there just in case. Remember, the United States Army maintained war plans for the eventuality of basically anything happening. You have a plans division. So, for example, you don't just plan, well, it's the 1890s, who might we go to war against? Spain? So we'll make a plan for Spain. Well, the War Plans Division would have plans for war against Canada, Mexico, Germany, Brazil, United Kingdom, France. The War Plans Division had plans for wars against everybody and what to do to defend against everybody, which is why those forts, these coastal defences were so important, because if the Americans and the British had got into any kind of tussle prior to World War I over international trade or control of the sea, and the British decided to sail its mighty navy. Now remember, in that period, the Royal Navy, there was a naval law in Britain that the size of the Royal Navy, those battleships in that pre-World War I period, the Royal Navy had to be as large as the next two largest navies combined. So if you had 50 battleships and somebody else had 30 battleships, then the Royal Navy are going to say, well, we need 81 battleships. We need to have so many more battleships than you do. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, everything. The Royal Navy has to be twice the size of the next largest navies. So if the Americans and the British had ever got into kind of a fractious argument before World War I, then these coastal defences would have been absolutely necessary, and they would have dusted off war plan number whatever it was, blown the dust off the war plan and been like, well, this is how these particular coastal defences are going to deal with British invasion, not just the Spanish or the French. So there were plans for everything, which is why coastal defences were still important during that Spanish-American War period, during World War I, even though the United States was neutral for a significant period of World War I. There was the possibility that somebody could attack, a surprise attack. You all have heard of the Zinnemann telegram, so proposals from the Germans to attack the United States using Mexico as an ally. So there was the possibility that the United States could have been attacked during World War I. So the forts are important during World War I. They're maintained often with skeleton staff and skeleton maintenance during the interwar period. Remember, we're talking about economic hardship and cutbacks, and so in that interwar period, the coastal defences were manned and maintained, but not at full strength. And then in World War II, coastal artillery comes back in again. Not really as much because of the threat posed by enemy surface combatants. The Tirpitz and the Bismarck were not heading across the Atlantic to bombard Atlantic City, New Jersey, and disrupt the bathing. But the coast of the United States, really from the Jersey Shore down through the Virginia Capes to what's off now the Outer Banks of North Carolina, was an important theatre of naval warfare during World War II because of the German U-boat attacks. German submarines could make their way across the Atlantic. There was no blackout on the American coast, so all the lights were shining brightly. Ships were sailing up and down, coastal freighters were sailing up and down, coastal oilers were sailing up and down without any kind of convoy system, and were easy pickings for these German submarines off the coast. So the coastal defences were still necessary during that period, particularly here at the Delaware. You did not want German submarines sneaking up the Delaware River and causing chaos, either by laying mines, mining the river, or laying off the capes and torpedoing ships as they moved in and out of the port of Philadelphia, and the port of Wilmington, and the port of Chester. So coastal defences were necessary. That's when these big 8-inch and 16-inch guns are perhaps not as important as the smaller guns. You see batteries established here of 3-inch guns, so similar to the small guns you might see on a destroyer or a destroyer escort at sea. Smaller guns of smaller caliber, shorter range, quicker firing, quite often quick firing guns. They could be reloaded and refired very quickly, but batteries of those are established that give much more closer control over the littoral element. So when we talk about a 16-inch gun, we talk about an 8-inch gun, we talk about firing 15 miles, we talk about firing 20 miles. These are long-range artillery. Now we want stuff that can fire 5 miles and pick off people that are sneaking in very close to where you are. Also during this period, World War II in particular, we're now looking at the war in the air. So the war is now a three-dimensional war. We're looking at ground combat, we're looking at naval combat, and we're looking at aerial combat. World War II is really, there is aerial combat of course in World War I, but not in the way of strategic bombing, not in the way of aircraft carriers, etc. Nothing in World War I would compare to the attack at Pearl Harbor, or before that at Taranto, or anything like that. So there has to be work developed on anti-aircraft defences, and so Fort Miles in particular has anti-aircraft defences. 3-inch guns are used for that as well, because they can be used dual purpose as a surface or an anti-aircraft gun, but also 90mm anti-aircraft guns are installed here as well. When the Cold War begins, when World War II has ended and the Cold War begins, some of the older posts now in 1945 immediately are decommissioned. They're no longer required. Fort Mott is no longer required. Fort Delaware is no longer required. These are put into really a fire sale, most often given over to, around the country, these coastal forts are most often given over to state governments that either find alternative use for them or turn them into state parks. So two here in the Delaware defences that remain in use are Fort DuPont, up towards Delaware City, where the refinery is, and the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal is, and also here at Fort Miles. Fort Miles is particularly important in this period as an air defence centre. So we're in a period now in that post-World War II, early Cold War period, when the Soviets obtain the atomic and then the hydrogen bomb. There's the possibility that Soviet long-range aircraft may come down over the North Pole and bomb the East Coast. So anti-aircraft defences, Cold War anti-aircraft defences in that early period, 1950s, are very, very important. Gun batteries remain important. High-firing anti-aircraft guns are important. But also Nike and Hercules batteries, early anti-aircraft surface-to-air missile batteries. They're not mobile, they're static, so they have to have solid concrete pads on which to fire. And so some of these former coastal defence posts are then very useful to be re-rolled as sites for Nike defence batteries. So if you want to go away and Google something later, if you look for the Nike and Hercules batteries, so Nike like the goddess or the shoe, and Hercules, I guess like Hercules the god, but if you Google for Nike and Hercules batteries in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, you'll be able to quickly get a map of all of the locations in which these batteries were located around the Philadelphia area, providing this anti-aircraft umbrella of not only anti-aircraft guns, the old-fashioned anti-aircraft guns, radar directed of course, but the earliest surface-to-air missiles, those Nike and Hercules missiles. So Fort DuPont continued in use. I'm actually now, it's a 90mm anti-aircraft gun right there. This would be, you could fire that manually over open sites. More typically, you'd radio direction find this. And then I'm in amongst here 3-inch dual-purpose guns, which could be used on high elevation for, so dual angle mounting, high elevation for anti-aircraft fire, lower elevation for surface engagement. So I'm in what was the barracks area now at Fort Miles, and this is one of the static displays down here is of these anti-aircraft guns. I'm going to flip, so as I said, we don't touch, we don't climb upon, but we can get close enough to read. Look, you see, US Navy Bureau of Ordnance, 3-inch housing, Mark II, and we're looking at manufactured by Continental Chicago, inspector's mark, and approved and accepted into use 1943. So, as I say, we don't have to touch these things, but we can get close enough to find out a lot of additional information about what we're looking at. Fort DuPont continued in government use as a Veterans Health Centre, and also remains in use, a small portion of it remains in use today, still as a military post. It remains one of the armories of the Delaware Army National Guard. So I believe there's a military police unit based there at the moment. But the rest of it has been turned into a state park that you can walk and wander, look at the Delaware River, have a picnic, check out the historic district. There are a lot of buildings remaining there. So I'm looking here at 1940s barrack blocks. There's not really a lot you can do with these. At Fort DuPont, there are much more solid buildings, red brick buildings. There's gymnasium, the old swimming pool, and the old health clinics, etc. And so some of these buildings have been put up by the state of Delaware for what they call adaptive use, which means if you're a non-profit, you're an NGO, you can come to the state of Delaware and say, We are the Fort Delaware Historical Society. There's not a lot of room on Fort Delaware itself for us to have our administrative offices, our fundraising efforts, to hold conferences and meetings, etc. Also, the water and power situation out there is a lot worse than it is on the mainland. So can we have one of the old army buildings here at Fort DuPont to use as our non-profit headquarters? And the state of Delaware will say, here's the peppercorn rent and here's the building for you. So this is a good place for if you are trying to establish a non-profit in the area for the benefit of the state of Delaware and Delaware veterans, Delaware history. Then Fort DuPont's a good location for that because there are surplus buildings that can be used there within that historical area. The last one to decommission of all the forts on these coastal defences was here at Fort Miles. Fort Miles was the last to decommission. It was the last to be the headquarters as the other ones closed. And this became the last post. It became the, where are we, Building 601. This was one of the admin buildings. I believe this was the post office. Fort Miles became the last headquarters of the river defences, the coastal defences of the Delaware River, until that closed and was handed over to the state of Delaware to use as a state park. What have we else got over here? Building 600 over there was a rec centre. 606 behind me was a barracks. You can see very simple cement block design, very simple cement block chimneys, very simple tar paper roof, very simple construction, and yet still here, still standing. Some 70 years after these were put up, makes me wonder whether the house that I live in, built just 3 years ago, will be here in another 67 years, or whether it will be falling to pieces through modern construction methods compared to old construction methods. But there we go. So anyway, Fort Miles was the last handed over as a state park, and that's what it is today. We've covered only let's have a look down the driveway here. We've covered only a small part of the state park. It stretches with battery positions, mold abandoned concrete battery positions, and walking trails and cycling trails all along the coast here at Lewes, Delaware. That's if you're looking for where to come to, Lewes, Delaware, Lewes, Delaware. You can get here by highway on off of the coastal highway, off of Delaware Route 1 or US 13, easily accessible. If you're coming down from New York, New Jersey, that area, you can just come down the length of New Jersey all the way down to Cape May and catch the ferry across. There's lots of ways to get here. I want to give you a view up there of this curious feature that you might think, is that a water tower? I don't think I can actually zoom in on that. I don't think we've got the zoom feature on the live stream. But no, we're not looking at a water tower there. What we're looking at, and you see it there. That tower there sticking above the tree line with the observation deck on the top, now used for photography, for bird watching, etc. That's one of the round towers, one of the observation towers that are all down the Delaware coastline here. If you drive down the Delaware coastline, south of Lewes, south of Rehoboth, and you drive down towards the Maryland line on Fenwick Island, you'll see along the beach and along the coastline these round towers. These were observation towers for the, as I said, the submarine warfare. These were to spot enemy submarines and also possibly to spot enemy aircraft, although that would be unlikely that the Germans would get aircraft across to this side of the Atlantic, but particularly to spot submarines on the surface and any ships that were sinking had been sunk by submarines, so that aid could be sent out, and also if they could be spotted on the surface, these coastal batteries could be called upon to fire upon these submarines, and if you could bring a coastal battery to bear, you could bring then out anti-submarine escorts, sub-chasers, etc., to hunt those down with depth chargers and hedgehogs. So there's a series of this, and these is one of the ones here at Fort Miles that you can actually park in the parking lot and climb up the tower. Some of them are open to the public, some of them of course are in a terrible state of maintenance and not open to the public. So there is a Fort Miles Museum here, not always open, so check on the website for opening hours if you really want to come and see the museum. If you're not particularly interested in walking around the museum but you just want to walk around the trails, take in the battery positions, look at the ordnance, then as I said, I believe the entry fee for a state of Delaware resident is $5 for the day, a non-resident $10 for the day, gets you access to the entire state park, walking trails, beachfront, picnic areas, etc. So certainly a lovely place to visit on a day like today. Quite hot. I'm glad I wore seersucker, and I'm glad I bought water. So that's really the story of the harbour defences of the Delaware, dating back to that colonial period, those first Swedish, Dutch encampments along the river. Then in the 1770s, Fort Mifflin, dating back to that Revolutionary War period, through the War of 1812, through the Civil War. Should be noted that during the Civil War, Fort Delaware and Fort DuPont, as well as being coastal fortifications, were also used as prisoner of war camps for Confederates. Fort Delaware in particular, out there on Pea Patch Island, they installed row upon row upon row of wooden barracks, initially designed to hold 11,000 prisoners. At one point those barracks were so overcrowded they was holding 33,000 Confederate prisoners. So not in the greatest of conditions, nowhere near as bad as say in Andersonville, but certainly overcrowded. And if men caught contagious diseases of the day, such as even dysentery, diarrhea, men could die of simple waterborne contamination in those days. So about 4,500 Confederate prisoners actually died at Fort Delaware. Fort DuPont was used as a prisoner of war camp in World War II. Several hundred German prisoners of war were interned at Fort DuPont in World War II. So these places saw multiple uses, both defensive areas, prisoner of war camps, health centres, administrative areas, all sorts of different things. And the history extends really from that period of the 1600s almost into the 1960s. So almost 3 full centuries of life and history here on this short stretch of the Delaware River between the Delaware Cape and up there at Pea Patch Island, where the river turns and heads up towards Philadelphia. So I would encourage you, if you're in the area, to come out to any of these historic locations. They are all accessible. Everything I've talked about today is accessible. You can visit Fort Mifflin, that 1770s fort. You can visit Fort Delaware. You can visit Fort DuPont. You can visit Fort Miles. Did I miss any out? I don't think so. But you can visit them all. They're all open to the public. Or Fort Mott across in New Jersey. You can visit all of these locations today. Some have a small charge for admission. Others you can get into for free and walk around, such as Fort Mott. Bring your family. Bring a picnic. You can walk your dogs, you can cycle trails. These are fantastic places to come out and visit here on the this mid-Atlantic coast, this New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland region. Very, very accessible from New York, very accessible from Washington, D.C., from Richmond. Go further inland to Kentucky, West Virginia, Indiana. These are very easy places to get to by car and to visit. So I'd very much recommend you coming out. I've been posting some photographs and some additional information in the discussion topic that goes with the talk today. So I hope that's been of some interest to you. I'm going to go through the comments that you guys have kindly been posting. If there's any spam links in there for the Indian guys that keep jumping in and posting their financial phishing ads in there to try and get your credit card numbers and so on, I will delete those as I always do, and then I will answer any questions that you guys post in the comments to this video or in the comments to those photographs that I've been posting in the group. So thank you for joining me today. It's a beautiful day out here. I'm going to take full advantage of being here at State Park on a nice day. I've got plenty of water, I've got plenty of snacks. I even think I've got a Wooby in the back, so I can lay out a blanket and have a snooze under the sun. I might do that later as well. And I'm going to walk some more of the trails, take some more photographs, look at some of the nature trails that are through here. Pinelands Nature Trail I want to walk through. That's not a concrete trail, it's a sand and dirt trail that takes you through the sand dunes. So I want to look at, I really want to look for some of those coastal cactus that you sometimes see in this area, because those absolutely fascinate me. So thanks for joining me today. Thanks for support that you give to us here with these talks that we do. Check out on the Facebook page, facebook.com/walkingtheground. For under events, there'll be additional events coming up, such as I believe we've got some watch parties coming up for a couple of movies where you can watch along, and there'll be a chat box next to the movie. We're going to watch those through Amazon Prime. I'm also going to look at maybe doing one through YouTube, do a YouTube watch party, so we might be able to do that. Shift the platforms around a little bit, so if those of you who don't have access to Amazon, but you can watch something for free on YouTube, we will do that as well. We'll schedule some of those in the future. We have additional visits coming up. We're going to go and do a visit to Cooch's Bridge, a 1777 American Revolutionary War battlefield. We're going to head out to Elk Neck and try and hunt down a coastal defense battery, actually, well, a river defense battery at head of Elk from the War of 1812. We're going to try and find the location of that. That's eluded me for a while. I'm determined to find it, and I will find it with you on video, and we'll talk about that. So, and there'll be some additional trips coming up. I believe I have a wedding to attend out in Tawnytown, Maryland, so conveniently that's going to be close to, oh gosh, Tawnytown, conveniently close to Gettysburg. So I may do a quick Sunday morning broadcast the day after from Gettysburg on that. And then we're heading out west. You can see I've already posted a link to, it's kind of battlefield related. It's just sort of like in a unique way. I wanted to talk about, when I land, I'm flying out to Denver, so I'm going to be in that immediate area before I move on from there. And I thought, well, what can I talk about here? I'm not heading in the direction of Sand Creek. I'm heading in the opposite direction, so I can't get down there really and talk so much about about Indian War campaigns. But I thought it was an interesting thing. I would talk about the Colorado Coalfield War of 1913-1914, one of the largest labor uprisings in the United States history, in which private detectives and the Colorado National Guard battled with thousands of armed miners over the period September 1913 to December 1914. So like a 16 month period of industrial unrest, armed industrial unrest in the Colorado coalfields. I thought we'd talk about that by going to some of those locations that, as a result of that, those mines were abandoned. 6 of those mines were abandoned, and the Colorado coal industry kind of collapsed. So we'll go look at that and talk a little bit about that before hitting the road out west and moving down into, I think we're going to move down into Kansas, and we're going to start looking for some Indian War sites and doing some broadcasts from some Indian War sites. So check the events section for details of that as it comes up, and we hope to see you during early June as we're moving across the country, coming back from Denver, back towards the East Coast in a slow, meandering manner that allows us to stop at, I don't know, historic Fort Hays. We might be able to get to the Cav Museum at Fort Riley. You know me and my cavalry. And we may be able to stop at some other historic locations as well on the way back, and take in some of those historic sites from Colorado, Kansas, Missouri. We're moving then across, I guess, into Ohio, coming back across Ohio. So I look forward to you joining us then. Thank you for your support here on Facebook. Thank you for your support on YouTube. Thank you for the follows and the retweets on Twitter. I do appreciate all that support. Thank you to the people that have donated a coffee, and Ko-fi.com, link in the bio, etc. If you appreciate what we're doing today with these tours, and you'd like to donate me a coffee or a water, considering today's heat, you can do that. $3 donation would be absolutely lovely, but you're under no requirement to do that at all. I'm going to keep doing these and keep doing these for free, whether you send me a coffee or not, but I would appreciate one. So if you want to support me in that way, that's a good way to financially support these historical tours. Thanks for joining me, everybody, and I will see you next week.